There's a peculiar sensation that comes over certain people at certain moments in their lives, a feeling that's extraordinarily difficult to put into words, and yet once you've experienced it, you recognize it immediately in others who have passed through the same strange portal. It's as if you're standing in a crowded room, perhaps at a party, or a business meeting, or even just walking down a busy street, and suddenly you become aware that you're watching a play, observing a theatrical performance in which everyone, including yourself until this very moment, has been completely absorbed in their roles. The actors are so convincing, so thoroughly identified with their characters, that they've forgotten their acting at all. But now, inexplicably, you've stumbled backstage while the play is still going on. You can see both the performance and the machinery behind it simultaneously, and there's no way to unsee what you've seen. This isn't about being superior to others. That would merely be another role, another costume worn by the ego to maintain its sense of separation and specialness. No, what we're discussing here is something far more unsettling and far more liberating than simple intellectual superiority or spiritual pride. It's the growing recognition that the entire game of being a separate individual locked inside a bag of skin, pursuing happiness and running from suffering, competing and comparing, striving and achieving, that this whole elaborate construction might be, in the words of Shakespeare, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, or perhaps more accurately, signifying everything, but not in the way we've been taught to think about significance. You see, most people go through their entire lives in a state of what we might call existential sleep. They move through their days responding to stimuli, following scripts handed down through generations, pursuing goals that were never really their own to begin with, and experiencing themselves as isolated centers of consciousness peering out at a fundamentally alien universe through the windows of their eyes. This is considered normal. This is called being well-adjusted. To fit into society, to be a productive member of the community, one must accept without question this basic premise, that you are a separate ego, born into this world from somewhere else, destined to struggle against other separate egos for limited resources, and ultimately to die and return to the somewhere else from whence you came, or perhaps to dissolve into nothingness. Everything in our culture reinforces this mythology. Our languages, our institutions, our stories, our sciences, even our religions, despite their occasional mystical insights, have largely been domesticated into supporting this fundamental misidentification. But what happens when this hypnosis begins to break? What are the signs that you're starting to wake up from the collective dream, that you're beginning to see through the cosmic game of hide and seek that you've been playing with yourself since before you can remember? The first indication, and perhaps the most disorienting, is that you begin to notice a gap, a space, a silence, between what happens and your reaction to it. Most people experience life as a continuous stream of stimulus and response, with no daylight between the two. Someone insults them, and immediately they feel hurt or angry. They receive praise, and immediately they feel elated and validated. They're offered an opportunity for wealth or status, and immediately they feel desire and begin scheming. The response is automatic, mechanical, like a knee-jerking when the doctor taps it with that little rubber hammer. There's no consciousness in it, no real choice, just conditioned patterns running their predetermined courses. But now, if you're beginning to wake up, you notice something extraordinary. There's a pause. Someone says something that would normally trigger an automatic emotional cascade, and instead of being immediately swept away by the reaction, you find yourself watching the reaction arise, as if from a distance. It's like watching clouds form in a sky. You can see the emotion gathering, feel its texture and temperature, observe its movement through your consciousness, but somehow you're not entirely identified with it anymore. You haven't become some sort of emotionless robot. If anything, you're feeling things more fully and more vividly than before. But there's a part of you that remains untouched, unchanged, unmoved by the drama unfolding in the theatre of your personality. You're simultaneously the actor and the audience, the wave and the ocean, the dance and the dancer. This gap, this space of awareness, tends to appear first in moments of crisis or intense suffering, because suffering has a way of cracking open the shell of our habitual consciousness. When you've exhausted yourself trying to fix something that cannot be fixed, when you've reached the absolute limit of your ego's capacity to control life, there's sometimes a surrender that happens, and in that surrender, a strange peace. Not the peace of getting what you want, but the peace of finally stopping the war with what is. And in that peace, even if it lasts only a moment, you catch a glimpse of something that's always been here, always been you, but which you've been too busy to notice. A vast awareness that contains all experience, but is not limited by any particular experience. A consciousness that witnesses both joy and sorrow without being destroyed by either. Now, this might sound terribly abstract, and perhaps it is, but here's the thing. Once you've tasted this, once you've experienced even a flicker of this witnessing awareness, you can never quite go back to sleep in the same way again. Oh, you'll try. The ego will reassert itself, as it must. You'll get caught up in dramas and desires and fears. You'll forget what you've seen. You'll doubt whether it was real or just your imagination. But something has shifted. There's a tiny crack in the cosmic egg, and through that crack, light is beginning to pour in. You find yourself less interested in the content of your thoughts and more curious about the fact that you're thinking at all. You start to notice that the voice in your head, which you've always assumed was you, is actually something you're listening to, which means you must be something other than or larger than that voice. This is deeply disorienting when it first begins to happen, because our entire sense of identity is constructed around the assumption that we are our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, our bodies, our roles and relationships. If you're not the voice in your head, then who or what are you? And here's where many people, sensing the dissolution of their familiar identity, pull back in fear and quickly reconstruct the walls of their ego, perhaps even building them thicker and higher than before. The terror of ego death is real, because from the ego's perspective, this awakening is quite literally an annihilation. The separate self is being seen through, revealed as a kind of necessary fiction, a useful illusion that has served its purpose, but which isn't ultimately true in the way we've believed it to be. The second sign that you're waking up faster than those around you manifests in your relationship with time. Most people live almost entirely in psychological time, in their memories of the past and their anticipations or anxieties about the future. They're constantly telling themselves stories about what happened and what it means, and projecting themselves into imagined futures that they're either chasing after or running away from. The present moment is just a thin slice of experience that they're barely aware of, a kind of necessary gateway that they must pass through on their way from past to future. Their attention is always somewhere else, their minds chattering away about what was and what might be, and in this state of chronic distraction, they miss the only time that actually exists, which is now. But as you begin to wake up, something curious happens with time. You start to notice that the past and future exist only as thoughts arising in the present moment. Of course, this is obvious when you point it out. You can't actually experience anything except now. Even your memories of yesterday and your plans for tomorrow are happening right now, in this eternal present that never actually becomes past and never truly arrives as future. It's always now. It's only ever now. And yet this simple, obvious fact has the most profound implications imaginable. Because if there is only now, then the entire story of you as a separate entity born in the past and heading toward death in the future is revealed as a kind of thought form, a conceptual construction that has no reality outside of the thinking that creates it moment to moment. When you begin to rest in present moment awareness with increasing frequency, when you start to sense the timeless quality of this eternal now, the whole character of your experience shifts. Things that seem desperately urgent and important in psychological time begin to lose their grip on you. Not because you become irresponsible or apathetic, quite the opposite. You often find yourself more capable of effective action, more responsive to what the moment requires, precisely because you're not carrying the accumulated weight of past and future on your shoulders. The texture of experience becomes richer, more vivid, more immediate when you're actually present for it, rather than lost in thoughts about it. Colors seem brighter, sounds more crystalline, sensations more alive. This isn't because anything has changed in the objective world. It's because you've stopped filtering everything through the distorting lens of psychological time, through the endless mental commentary that usually mediates your relationship with reality. You're experiencing life directly, without the ego's constant need to interpret, judge, categorize, and relate everything back to the story of me and my life. And in this direct experience, there's a quality of freshness, of newness, as if you're seeing everything for the first time, which in a sense you are, because this particular configuration of the now has never existed before and will never exist again. This shift in your relationship with time often brings with it a kind of gentle humor about the whole human predicament. You begin to see how absurd it is that we spend our lives worrying about things that haven't happened yet and probably never will, or ruminating over things that happened in a past that no longer exists except as neural patterns and stories we tell ourselves. The sheer energy that goes into maintaining these elaborate time-based narratives about who we are and what our lives mean, it's exhausting and it's unnecessary, and yet nearly everyone is doing it, nearly all the time, with complete seriousness and conviction. When you start to see this clearly, it's both hilarious and heartbreaking. Hilarious because it's such an obvious case of mistaken identity, like watching someone search frantically for glasses that are sitting on top of their head. Heartbreaking because the suffering that arises from this fundamental confusion is real, even though its cause is illusory. Now, the third sign that you're waking up more rapidly than those around you has to do with your relationship to desire and aversion, what the Buddhists call the twin engines of suffering. In the normal state of consciousness, we're constantly in a state of lack, of incompleteness, of feeling that something is missing. We believe that happiness lies somewhere in the future, in the acquisition of something we don't have, or the getting rid of something we do have. If only I had more money. If only I had a better relationship. If only I could change my body, my circumstances, my past. Then I would finally be okay. Finally be happy. Finally be complete. This is the fundamental structure of desire, and it keeps us on a perpetual treadmill of seeking, where satisfaction is always just around the next corner, just beyond the next achievement or acquisition. As you begin to wake up, you start to see through this mechanism. Not because you become enlightened and transcend all desire. That would be another trap, another form of seeking, the desire to be desireless. Rather, you begin to notice the structure of desire itself, the way it operates, the assumptions it makes. You start to see that desire always contains within it the implication that you are incomplete right now, that something is wrong with the present moment, that you need to be somewhere other than where you are, someone other than who you are. And in seeing this, in really seeing it not just intellectually, but experientially, the grip of desire begins to loosen. This doesn't mean you stop wanting things or working toward goals. You still prefer comfort to discomfort, pleasure to pain, connection to isolation. These are natural expressions of life, of the body's wisdom. But there's a fundamental shift in how you relate to these preferences. Instead of feeling that your happiness depends on getting what you want, you begin to discover a happiness that's independent of conditions, a contentment that doesn't require the world to be any particular way. This is tremendously liberating, because you realize that you've been carrying around an assumption that was never questioned, that your state of being is determined by external circumstances, by what happens to you, by whether you get what you want or avoid what you fear. When this assumption is seen through, when you directly experience that the source of peace and well-being is not out there in the world, but in here in the space of awareness itself, everything changes. You become free in a way that has nothing to do with changing your circumstances. You can still work to improve things, to alleviate suffering, to create beauty and value in the world, but you're no longer doing it from a place of desperate incompleteness, from the anxious conviction that you must have these things in order to be okay. Instead, action arises naturally and spontaneously from the wholeness that you already are, from the overflowing abundance of this present moment, which lacks nothing, which is already complete, which has always been complete. This recognition tends to make you somewhat incomprehensible to people who are still caught in the mechanism of seeking. They look at you and see someone who doesn't seem to be trying as hard as they are, who doesn't appear to be driven by the same desperate urgency to achieve and acquire and become, and they don't quite know what to make of it. Are you lazy? Unmotivated? Have you given up? Or have you somehow found something they're still searching for? The truth is both stranger and simpler than any of these explanations. You haven't given up or found something new. Rather, you've stopped overlaying the present moment with the psychological fiction of lack. You've stopped believing the story that says you're incomplete, and in that stopping, the inherent completeness of what you are shines through. The fourth sign of awakening manifests in your relationship to other people and to the whole notion of separation itself. Under normal circumstances, we experience ourselves as separate individuals locked inside our own skulls, looking out at a world of other separate individuals, all of us essentially alone, occasionally connecting through the limited channels of language and gesture, but never really touching, never really knowing each other's inner experience. This sense of separation isn't just a mild inconvenience, it's the source of most human suffering. It gives rise to loneliness, to the anxiety of being a tiny, isolated fragment in a vast and indifferent universe, to the competitive mindset that sees others as threats or obstacles to my happiness, to the desperate need for validation and recognition from these other separate beings whose approval might temporarily relieve my sense of isolation. But as you wake up, as the center of your identity begins to shift from the ego to awareness itself, something remarkable happens. The boundaries between self and other become less solid, less absolute. You begin to have experiences, perhaps subtle at first, but increasingly undeniable, of a deeper unity underlying the apparent multiplicity of separate beings. This isn't mystical mumbo-jumbo or wishful thinking. It's a direct perception, as immediate and undeniable as seeing color or hearing sound. You look into someone's eyes and recognize something familiar there, something that's not different from what's looking out through your own eyes. You feel another person's pain or joy, not as something happening to them over there, but as a fluctuation in the one consciousness that's experiencing itself through all these different perspectives simultaneously. This recognition doesn't eliminate the appearance of separation. You still see distinct bodies, distinct personalities, distinct perspectives, but it adds another dimension to your perception. You see both the multiplicity and the unity, both the waves and the ocean. And in this expanded perception, your relationships with others undergo a profound transformation. Competition begins to feel absurd because you're not really competing with separate others. You're watching one consciousness play all the different parts in this cosmic drama. Judgment softens because you recognize that whatever another person is doing, however unconscious or harmful it might be, is something that the totality is doing, is an expression of the whole playing out through that particular form, just as your own thoughts and actions are expressions of the same undivided whole playing out through this form. This doesn't lead to moral relativism or passive acceptance of harm. Again, quite the opposite. When you see others as yourself, when the boundaries between self and other become porous, you naturally move to alleviate suffering, to create conditions for flourishing, because there's no longer a clear distinction between your suffering and theirs, your flourishing and theirs. Compassion arises not as a moral duty or spiritual practice, but as a spontaneous expression of your true nature, like a hand reaching out to help another part of the same body. The illusion of separation was never really protecting you or serving you. It was just making you feel small and scared and alone. As that illusion weakens, what emerges is not some vague cosmic soup where nothing matters, but a vivid sense of intimate connection with all life, combined with a growing recognition of the unthinkable mystery that's expressing itself as all these different forms. People who are still identified with the separate self often find this perspective threatening or incomprehensible. If you try to explain it, they might accuse you of grandiosity. Oh, so you think you're one with the universe, do you? That's quite an ego trip. And they're not entirely wrong to be skeptical, because the ego is perfectly capable of appropriating non-dual insights and turning them into another identity, another story about how special and enlightened I am. But genuine recognition of non-separation is actually the dissolution of that kind of specialness, not its apotheosis. When you see that you're not a separate wave but the entire ocean, you also see that everyone else is the same ocean, which means nobody is special, or more accurately, everything is special, everything is sacred, because it's all the one thing appearing as many things, the infinite playing at being finite, the eternal pretending to be born and to die. This brings us to the fifth sign, which in many ways encompasses and deepens all the others. You begin to experience existence itself as a kind of play, a cosmic game, what the Hindus call Leela, the divine play of consciousness. Now, this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of awakening to communicate, because from the perspective of the suffering ego, life is deadly serious. There are real problems, real threats, real stakes. People are dying, species are going extinct, injustices are being perpetrated, suffering is real and pervasive, and to call all of this a game or play seems not just wrong, but obscene, a kind of spiritual bypassing that trivializes genuine anguish. And yet, what if both are true simultaneously? What if life is utterly serious from one perspective and utterly playful from another, and the awakening consciousness learns to hold both perspectives at once without contradiction? Think about children at play. Watch them, really watch them, and you'll see that they take their games completely seriously while they're playing them. The princess really is in danger. The dragon really is threatening. The castle really must be defended. The emotional investment is total. The drama is real and immediate. And yet, at the same time, it's play. The children know on some level that this is make-believe, that they're making it all up, that they could stop at any moment and choose a different game. The seriousness and the playfulness coexist without cancelling each other out. Now imagine that the entire universe is like this. A game that consciousness is playing with itself, taking on all these different roles, creating all these different dramas, investing completely in the experience, while simultaneously knowing, on some deeper level, that it's all a magnificent improvisation, a cosmic performance with no audience except the performer, who has become so absorbed in the roles that it has temporarily forgotten its own nature. As you wake up, you begin to sense this ludic quality at the heart of existence. You start to see that the universe is not a machine grinding meaninglessly toward heat death, nor is it a moral testing ground where souls are sorted into sheep and goats. It's more like a work of art, an endless creative expression, consciousness exploring all the ways it can experience itself, all the forms it can take, all the stories it can tell. And you, this apparent individual reading these words, are not separate from that creative expression. You are that expression. You are consciousness playing the role of a person who is waking up to what they really are. This recognition brings with it a quality of lightness, of humor, of wonder that's quite distinct from the grim seriousness with which most people approach existence. It's not that suffering becomes less real or less painful. If anything, you may feel suffering more acutely because you're not as defended against it, not as invested in maintaining the illusion that you can control life enough to avoid pain. But there's something else present now, something that remains untouched even in the midst of suffering, an awareness that holds both the tragedy and the comedy, both the meaning and the meaninglessness, without having to choose between them or reconcile them into some coherent philosophy. You begin to see that the whole human project of trying to make sense of existence, of constructing elaborate metaphysical systems and religious doctrines and scientific theories to explain what this is and what we're supposed to do about it, this whole enterprise is itself part of the play, part of the game. Consciousness loves to play hide and seek with itself, to pretend to be lost so it can experience the joy of being found, to fragment itself into apparently separate beings so it can experience the ecstasy of reunion. Every spiritual tradition, every philosophy, every story ever told is just another move in this infinite game, another way for consciousness to explore itself, to create texture and drama and meaning in the midst of the formless void. When you start to sense this, the whole quality of your engagement with life shifts. You still care about things, perhaps even more deeply than before, But the caring is no longer tinged with that quality of desperate attachment, that sense that everything depends on getting the outcome right. You do what you do, you play your part in the great drama, but you're no longer laboring under the misapprehension that your happiness depends on controlling the uncontrollable, that your peace requires the world to conform to your preferences. There's a spontaneity that enters your actions, a creativity, a willingness to improvise and experiment, because you've stopped being so damn serious about maintaining your image, your security, your identity. This playful quality can be deeply disconcerting to people who are still convinced that life is a problem that needs to be solved, a test that needs to be passed, a battle that needs to be won. They look at you and sense something they might call irresponsibility or flakiness or lack of ambition. How can you be so light about things? Don't you understand what's at stake? Don't you see how serious all of this is? And the strange thing is, you do see how serious it is. You see the suffering, you see the stakes, you feel the pain of the world perhaps more vividly than they do. But you also see something else, something they've missed in their earnest striving, that seriousness and playfulness are not opposites, that you can engage fully with life without believing that you're separate from it, that the deepest response to existence is not grim determination, but wonder, not control, but participation, not knowing, but being. Now, all of these signs we've been discussing, the gap of awareness, the shift in relationship to time, the loosening of desire, the weakening of separation, the recognition of existence as play, these are not separate phenomena, but different facets of the same fundamental transformation. They're all expressions of a consciousness that's beginning to wake up from its identification with the limited, separate self and recognizing its true nature as the unlimited awareness within which all experience arises. And this brings us to what might be the most challenging aspect of this whole discussion. What do you do when you start to wake up and you realize that most of the people around you are still asleep? How do you relate to a world that's still operating according to rules and assumptions that you've seen through? How do you function in a society that's predicated on the very illusions that you're in the process of transcending? This is not an abstract problem. It has real implications for your relationships, your work, your daily interactions. You find yourself sitting in meetings where people are taking enormously seriously things that you can see are just collective agreements, arbitrary constructs that we've decided to pretend are real and important. You watch people suffer over problems that you can see are created entirely by their way of thinking about their situation, not by the situation itself. You observe the elaborate social dances that people perform, the masks they wear, the roles they play, and you remember when you too were fully identified with those performances, when you didn't know there was anything else. There's a temptation here, and it's important to recognize it clearly. The temptation to feel superior, to judge others for their unconsciousness, to position yourself as the enlightened one among the sleepwalkers. This is a trap, and it's a seductive one, because the ego is desperate to maintain its sense of specialness, and if it can't be special by being more successful, or more attractive, or more talented than others, it will happily be special by being more awakened, more conscious, more evolved. But this is just another game of separation, another way that the separate self tries to maintain itself, and it completely misses the point of what awakening actually is. True awakening includes the recognition that there is no you who is more awakened than them. There's just consciousness waking up to itself through various forms at various rates, playing out the whole drama of ignorance and enlightenment, separation and union, sleep and awakening. The form through which you're experiencing life happens to be going through a phase of increased lucidity right now, but that's not because you are doing something right, that they are doing wrong. It's simply what's happening, the way clouds happen, or flowers happen, or waves happen. In the grand scheme of things, there's nobody who's ahead or behind, nobody who's winning or losing at the game of enlightenment. There's just the infinite playing at being finite, the eternal pretending to be temporal, consciousness hiding from itself so thoroughly that it forgets what it is, and then gradually, inexorably, remembering. When you really understand this, when you see it not just as a concept, but as a living reality, It changes everything about how you relate to others. The judgment falls away, or at least softens considerably. The need to convince or convert or awaken others loses its urgency, because you see that everyone is exactly where they need to be, doing exactly what they need to do, learning exactly what they need to learn. This doesn't mean you become passive, or stop trying to alleviate suffering, or stop sharing what you've seen. But there's a quality of patience and acceptance that enters your interactions, a recognition that you can't wake someone else up, you can't force the process, you can't make the seed sprout by pulling on it. All you can do is be as awake as you are in this moment, express your understanding as clearly as you can, and trust that those who are ready to hear will hear, those who are ready to see will see, and those who aren't will think you're crazy, which is fine too, because that's part of the game as well. There's an interesting paradox here that's worth exploring. On one hand, you see that everyone is already awake, that consciousness is all there is, that separation was always an illusion, that there's nowhere to go and nothing to achieve, because you are already, and have always been, the infinite awareness that you've been seeking. This is the absolute perspective, the view from nowhere, the truth that transcends all relative truths. But on the other hand, from the relative perspective, from the point of view of these apparent individual beings moving through space and time, there clearly are degrees of awakening, stages of development, processes of transformation. People suffer more or less depending on their level of identification with the ego. They create suffering for others based on their degree of unconsciousness, and there genuinely is something we might call spiritual growth or evolution, even if from the absolute perspective, there's nobody growing and nowhere to go. The awakening consciousness learns to hold both perspectives simultaneously without trying to collapse one into the other. Yes, from the ultimate point of view, everything is already perfect, already complete, already enlightened, because there's nothing other than consciousness, and consciousness is always fully itself. But from the relative point of view, there's very much a journey, a path, a process of waking up, and that process matters. It has consequences. It makes a difference in terms of how much suffering there is in the world. You learn to be what we might call a functional dualist, operating in the relative realm of cause and effect, choice and consequence, self and other, while simultaneously knowing that all of this is happening within the non-dual awareness that you are, that none of it touches what you most fundamentally are. This ability to move fluidly between absolute and relative perspectives, to honor both while clinging to neither, is one of the hallmarks of mature awakening. The person who's just had their first glimpse of non-dual awareness often makes the mistake of trying to live entirely from the absolute perspective, denying the relative realm altogether. They might say things like, "There's no one here, there's nothing to do, it's all perfect as it is," while their life falls apart around them, and they cause harm to themselves and others through their spiritual bypassing. They've seen something true, but they've mistaken a glimpse for the whole picture, and they're trying to force their experience into a conceptual framework that doesn't include the messy complexity of actual embodied existence. The more integrated awakening recognizes that being human means living in the relative realm while simultaneously knowing your true nature as the absolute. You pay your taxes and wash your dishes and go to work, not because you're still identified with the separate self, but because this is what the form requires. This is how consciousness expresses itself through this particular body-mind. This is the dance that's being danced through you. You don't transcend the human experience. You include it, you embrace it, you inhabit it fully while knowing it's not ultimately what you are. This is what makes awakening relevant and practical, rather than just an interesting altered state that has no connection to daily life. Now, when you're waking up faster than those around you, you often find yourself in a kind of liminal space, a between zone where you're no longer fully identified with the conventional worldview, but you haven't yet stabilized in your realization either. This can be an uncomfortable place to be. You're living in two worlds simultaneously, the world of form and the world of emptiness, the world of becoming and the world of being, the world where problems need to be solved and the world where there are no problems, because there's no separate self to have problems. You might feel alienated from people who are still fully embedded in the conventional view, because their concerns and priorities seem less substantial to you now, less urgent, less ultimately meaningful. But you might also feel alienated from the small number of people who are speaking about awakening, because their descriptions don't quite match your experience, or because you sense they're more awake to the concepts of awakening than to the reality itself. This loneliness is part of the process, and it's important not to try to escape from it prematurely by either regressing back into comfortable unconsciousness or rushing forward into some imagined state of permanent enlightenment. The loneliness itself is teaching you something important. It's showing you the last vestiges of your identification with being a separate individual, the ways you still want to be understood and validated and recognized by others, the ways you're still hoping that awakening will make you special or give you some status in the eyes of others. When you can simply be with the loneliness without trying to fix it or explain it away, when you can let it be here without making a problem out of it, something shifts. The loneliness reveals itself to be another appearance in consciousness, another experience arising and passing, and underneath it, prior to it, there's a silence, a stillness, a completeness that doesn't need company or understanding or recognition. As this deeper aloneness reveals itself, not loneliness, which is the pain of feeling separate, but aloneness, which is the recognition that you are all one, that there's nothing outside of what you are. You begin to relax into your experience in a new way. You stop trying so hard to bridge the gap between your understanding and others' understanding. You stop feeling so responsible for waking people up or proving that what you've seen is real. You simply live from what you know, express what's true for you, and let others respond however they respond. Some will be intrigued, some will be threatened, some will think you're deluded, some will recognize something familiar in what you're saying, even if they can't articulate it themselves. All of these responses are just consciousness responding to itself, the infinite playing all the parts in this grand drama. There's tremendous freedom in this realization, but it's not the freedom of the ego to do whatever it wants without consequences. It's the freedom of recognizing that you're not ultimately the doer, that actions arise spontaneously from the totality of causes and conditions, that the separate self who would claim authorship of its deeds is itself just another appearance in consciousness. This doesn't absolve you of responsibility. If anything, it makes you more responsive, more attentive, more careful, because you see that your actions ripple out into the whole, affecting the whole, shaping the whole, since there is no boundary between you and the whole. In this state of increasing wakefulness, you often notice that your values and priorities begin to shift in ways that can't be easily explained to others. Things that once seemed crucially important, career advancement, social status, accumulating wealth, winning arguments, being right, being seen a certain way, these gradually lose their grip on you. Not because you've decided they're bad or wrong, but because you've seen through the assumptions that made them seem important in the first place. You thought you needed these things to be happy, to be secure, to be valuable, but now you've discovered a happiness that doesn't depend on external validation, a security that comes from knowing what you really are, a value that's intrinsic rather than conferred by others' opinions. This reorientation of values can create considerable friction with a society that's organized around the pursuit of exactly those things you're no longer particularly interested in. People wonder what's wrong with you. Why aren't you more ambitious? Why don't you seem to care about getting ahead? Why are you content with less when you could have more? They might interpret your lack of striving as depression, as giving up, as wasting your potential. And you can't really explain to them that you haven't lost anything. You've gained something, or perhaps more accurately, remembered something that makes their concerns seem less like ultimate reality and more like elaborate games that we've agreed to take seriously, but which aren't ultimately serious at all. This is not to say that you withdraw from the world or stop participating in these games. You might still pursue excellence in your work, not because you need it to validate your existence, but because craftsmanship is its own reward, because creating value is a natural expression of your being. You might still engage with political and social issues, not because you believe that fixing these problems will usher in utopia, but because reducing suffering is what naturally arises when you see others as yourself. You might still form relationships, pursue beauty, seek understanding, but all of it has a different flavor now. There's less grasping, less desperation, less sense that your happiness depends on these things working out the way you hope. People who are still caught in the conventional structures of meaning often find this attitude either inspiring or infuriating, depending on their temperament and their own readiness to question their assumptions. Those who are beginning to feel the limitations of the materialist, ego-based worldview might sense in you a possibility they hadn't considered, that there's a way to engage with life fully without being enslaved by desire, that peace is possible without getting all your ducks in a row. That meaning can be found in being rather than in achieving. These people might be drawn to you, might start asking questions, might want to know what you've discovered and how they might discover it too. But others, those who are still heavily invested in the conventional game, might find you threatening. Your lack of obvious striving might seem like a silent judgment of their own desperate pursuit of success. Your peace might highlight their anxiety. Your ability to be content with less might make them wonder why they need so much. They might try to pull you back into the game, to make you care about the things they care about, to get you back on the treadmill of ambition and achievement. They'll have good reasons, sensible reasons, socially approved reasons why you should want what they want. And if you're not careful, you might start to doubt your own perception, might start to think that maybe they're right, and you're the one who's missing something. This is why it's so important to trust your own direct experience, rather than deferring to consensus reality. The consensus, the collective agreement about what's real and important and valuable, is itself part of the hypnosis, part of the dream that you're waking up from. To stay awake requires a kind of existential courage, the courage to trust what you've seen, even when everyone around you is telling you that you're wrong, that you're confused, that you need to get back in line with the program. It requires the willingness to be thought strange or foolish or impractical, to not fit in, to not make sense according to the prevailing paradigm. And yet, paradoxically, as you become more established in your awakening, as you stop trying to make others understand or approve of your realization, you often become more effective in the world, not less. Because you're not coming from a place of lack or fear, your actions tend to be more aligned with what's actually needed, rather than with what your ego wants to prove or protect. Because you're not so invested in outcomes, you can take bigger risks, try more creative approaches, fail more gracefully. Because you're not comparing yourself to others or trying to be someone you're not, you can offer your unique gifts more freely, without the constant static of self-doubt and self-consciousness. You begin to live from what we might call your authentic nature, rather than from your conditioned personality. The conditioned personality is the accumulation of all the strategies you developed to get love, avoid pain, stay safe, be accepted. It's a necessary fiction that allowed you to survive and function in your particular family and culture, but it's not who you really are. It's a costume you put on, a role you play, and while it can be played well or poorly, it's never the truth of what you are. As you wake up, this costume becomes more transparent. You can still wear it when it's useful, but you're not identified with it anymore, not convinced that this is your actual face. This disidentification with your personality can be disconcerting for people who know you primarily through that personality. They might say things like, "You've changed," or "You're not yourself lately," or "What happened to you?" And they're right. You have changed, or more accurately, your identification has shifted from the temporary to the eternal, from the constructed to the unconditioned, from the character to the awareness within which the character appears. But how do you explain this to someone who still believes they are their character, who has no reference point for what you're pointing to? Often, you can't. Often, all you can do is live your truth and let them respond however they respond, trusting that if and when they're ready to question their own identification, something in how you're being might serve as a catalyst. One of the more challenging aspects of waking up faster than those around you is that you start to see the suffering inherent in unconsciousness, and you see how much of that suffering is unnecessary, how much of it is created by mistaken beliefs and false identifications. You see people torturing themselves with worry about futures that will never arrive, with guilt about pasts that can't be changed, with shame about imagined inadequacies, with fear of deaths that haven't happened. You see them caught in cycles of craving and aversion, addiction and avoidance, constantly seeking happiness in all the places it can't be found. And because you've begun to taste the freedom that comes from seeing through these patterns, there's naturally a desire to help, to point out what they're missing, to save them from their unnecessary suffering. But here's what you discover. You can't save anyone. You can't make anyone see what they're not ready to see. You can't argue someone into enlightenment or convince them to wake up. The most you can do is be a clear expression of your own realization, speak your truth when it's appropriate to do so, and create space for others to question their assumptions if they're inclined to do so. Some will be ready to hear, and for them, your words might act as a kind of permission to trust their own deepest intuitions, to explore the edges of their consciousness, to question the unquestionable. But many won't be ready, and for them, your insights will sound like nonsense, or worse, like a threat to everything they've built their lives around. Learning to be at peace with this, learning to not need others to validate your realization or join you in your understanding, is itself a profound teaching. It forces you to stand alone, to find your authority within rather than seeking it from external sources, to stop depending on others' recognition to confirm that what you've experienced is real. This is essential because the temptation to create a new identity around being awakened, to gather followers or students who will affirm your special status, is always there, and it's one of the subtlest traps on the spiritual path. The ego that appeared to die in the awakening can resurrect itself as the enlightened ego, the one who knows, the one who sees, the one who has transcended. And this is just another prison, another case of mistaken identity, another dream within the dream. True maturation in awakening involves the recognition that there's nothing special about you, nothing that makes you fundamentally different from anyone else, because the awareness that you are is the same awareness that everyone else is, whether they know it or not. The appearance of individuality remains. You still have your particular history, your particular talents and limitations, your particular way of expressing consciousness. But you know this individuality to be like a wave knowing itself to be ocean. The wave doesn't disappear, doesn't become less wave-like, but it knows its waveness to be a temporary manifestation of something much vaster, much more fundamental. When you rest in this understanding, there's a natural humility that arises, but it's not the false humility of the ego pretending to be humble in order to be seen as humble. It's the genuine humility that comes from seeing that this body-mind is just one of infinite expressions of the one consciousness, no more important than any other, no more valuable than a tree or a stone or a passing cloud. And simultaneously, there's a recognition of the absolute preciousness of this particular expression, this unique perspective, this irreplaceable moment of consciousness knowing itself through this particular form. Both are true. You're utterly ordinary and utterly extraordinary, completely insignificant and infinitely significant, a grain of sand and the entire beach. As you stabilize in this paradoxical understanding, you often find that your relationships deepen in unexpected ways. With people who are also exploring consciousness, there can be a quality of meeting that goes beyond the usual social transactions, beyond the exchange of information and opinions and stories about yourself. You meet in the space of awareness itself, recognizing in each other the same light looking out through different windows, the same silence singing different songs. These meetings can be profound and nourishing, reminding you that while the journey of awakening often involves periods of aloneness, you're not actually alone in this. There are others who have seen what you've seen, who are exploring this same territory, who can serve as companions and mirrors and fellow travelers. But even with people who aren't consciously on a spiritual path, your relationships can become more authentic, more immediate, more real, because you're not as invested in maintaining your persona or protecting your ego. You can afford to be more vulnerable, more honest, more present, because you're not as frightened of being seen, not as convinced that you need others' approval to be okay. This doesn't mean you become tactless or insensitive, quite the opposite, because you're more attuned to what's actually happening beneath the surface of social interactions. You can often meet people at a deeper level, respond to what they're really asking for, rather than just what they're saying, see through their defenses to the consciousness that's struggling to express itself through their conditioning. This capacity to see the deeper reality underlying surface appearances extends beyond human relationships to your entire experience of the world. You begin to see the sacred in the ordinary, the infinite in the finite, the miraculous in the mundane. A conversation with a stranger becomes a communion of consciousness. A walk in nature becomes a direct perception of the creativity of existence, endlessly expressing itself in form. Even activities that once seemed boring or tedious, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, waiting in line, become opportunities to rest in present moment awareness, to enjoy the simple fact of being alive, of being consciousness experiencing itself. This shift in perception is not something you do or make happen. It arises naturally as identification with the separate self weakens. When you're not constantly filtering experience through the ego's concerns, how does this affect me? Is this good or bad for me? What do I need to do about this? Then you can simply be with what is, and what is reveals itself to be endlessly interesting, endlessly mysterious, endlessly worthy of wonder. The boredom that characterizes so much of ordinary consciousness is revealed to be a symptom of disconnection from the aliveness of the present moment, a result of the mind's habit of comparing what is to what was or what could be, finding the present wanting, and escaping into fantasies or distractions. When you're fully present, nothing is boring, because presence itself is inherently alive, inherently fresh, inherently engaging. Even pain, even difficulty, even the so-called negative experiences become workable, become part of the richness of existence rather than problems to be solved or escaped from. You develop what we might call an appetite for reality, a willingness to show up for the full catastrophe of being human without needing it to be other than it is. This doesn't make you passive or resigned. You still work to alleviate suffering, to create beauty, to express love. But the work comes from a different place. It comes from abundance rather than lack, from wholeness rather than incompleteness, from love rather than fear. Now, as your awakening deepens, you might notice that the very question that initiated this exploration, what are the signs that I'm waking up faster than everyone around me, begins to reveal its own limitations. The question contains within it certain assumptions, that there's a you who's waking up, that this waking up can be measured and compared, that there's value in being faster than others, that others are behind in some spiritual race. All of these assumptions come from the ego's perspective, from the separate self's need to locate itself in some hierarchy, to know where it stands, to measure its progress against others. But from the perspective of awakened awareness, these questions don't even arise, because there's no separate self to be ahead or behind, no race to run, no progress to measure. There's just this, consciousness expressing itself moment by moment, sometimes identified with form and sometimes not, sometimes conscious of itself and sometimes lost in the dream, but always itself, always whole, always complete. The apparent journey from ignorance to enlightenment, from sleep to waking, is itself a story that consciousness tells itself, a game it plays, a dance it dances. It's real from one perspective and utterly illusory from another, and the mature awakening holds both perspectives without needing to resolve them into a single consistent narrative. So if you've recognized yourself in any of these signs we've been discussing, if you've felt the strange sensation of waking up while those around you continue to dream, what do you do with this recognition? The answer is simultaneously simple and impossibly difficult. Nothing and everything. Nothing, in the sense that there's nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no state to attain that's better than this moment right now. Everything, in the sense that this moment calls for your complete engagement, your full presence, your wholehearted participation in the dance of existence. You live your life, you do what's yours to do, you respond to what arises, but you do it all from a different place, a place of not knowing rather than knowing, of openness rather than conclusion, of being rather than becoming. You share what you've seen when sharing is appropriate, and you remain silent when silence is called for. You help when help is needed, and you step back when stepping back is what's needed. You trust the intelligence of life itself to unfold exactly as it needs to unfold, while simultaneously recognizing that you are that intelligence, that your choices and actions are how life unfolds through this particular form. There's a teaching in Zen that goes something like this. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities of life continue, but they're infused with a different quality, a different flavor. The wood chopping becomes meditation, becomes prayer, becomes an expression of the infinite in finite form. The water carrying becomes dance, becomes art, becomes a celebration of the mystery that animates all things. Nothing changes, and everything changes. The world remains exactly as it is, and yet it's completely transfigured by the shift in consciousness that's occurred. As you move through your days with this awakened awareness, you become a kind of bridge between the sleeping and the awake, between the conventional and the transcendent, between the separate self and the unified field. You don't advertise this, you don't make a big deal out of it, but your presence itself becomes a subtle invitation to others to question their assumptions, to look more deeply at their experience, to consider the possibility that what they are is vastly more than what they've believed themselves to be. Some will accept this invitation, some will ignore it, some will reject it vehemently, and all of these responses are perfect. All of them are consciousness responding to itself in exactly the way it needs to respond in this moment. You begin to trust this process in a way that would have been impossible when you were still identified with the separate self, still convinced that you needed to control outcomes, manage other people's reactions, maintain your image, prove your worth. That whole exhausting project of self-maintenance falls away, or at least loosens its grip, and what emerges is a kind of spontaneous rightness in your actions, a sense that you're being lived rather than living, that life is flowing through you rather than you pushing against life. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop making choices. You still choose, you still act, you still engage fully with the relative realm of causes and effects. But the choices arise from a deeper place, from a wisdom that's not merely personal, from an intelligence that's not limited to your individual history and conditioning. This trust in the unfolding of life, this willingness to not know what comes next, to not have all the answers, to be okay with uncertainty and mystery, this might be one of the most difficult aspects of awakening for Western people in particular. Raised as we are in a culture that values knowing, controlling, planning, managing, optimizing. We're taught that the good life requires having clear goals and pursuing them systematically, that we should know what we want and go after it. That uncertainty is a problem to be solved through more information, more analysis, more strategic thinking. And all of that has its place, certainly. You can't navigate the practical demands of modern life without some capacity for planning and goal setting. But awakening reveals another dimension entirely, a dimension in which not knowing is not a deficit, but an opening, where uncertainty is not a problem but a portal, where the release of the need to control and manage every outcome leads not to chaos, but to a deeper order, not to aimlessness, but to a more authentic direction. You discover that when you're not constantly imposing your preferences and agendas on life, when you're not so convinced that you know how things should be, life has a way of organizing itself quite intelligently, quite beautifully, often in ways that your limited ego mind could never have anticipated or planned for. This doesn't mean you drift through life in a passive haze, waiting for the universe to tell you what to do. It means you learn to distinguish between the genuine intuitions and inspirations that arise from your deeper being, and the conditioned reactions and habitual patterns that arise from your psychological programming. You learn to trust the former and question the latter, to follow what has aliveness and energy behind it, rather than what you think you should do based on others' expectations or society's scripts. You become, in a sense, more yourself than you've ever been. Not because you've created some improved version of your ego, but because you've stopped pretending to be something you're not, stopped trying to conform to images and ideals that were never authentic to your true nature. As this authenticity deepens, you often find that you're drawn to express what you're seeing and understanding in some form, through writing, through teaching, through art, through your work, through how you show up in relationships, through the very quality of your presence. This impulse to share is not about convincing anyone of anything or converting them to your way of seeing, but simply a natural overflowing of what's been realized, the way a flower naturally releases its fragrance without trying to convince anyone of its beauty. Some will be drawn to this fragrance and some won't, and both are perfectly fine, because you're no longer coming from a place of needing others to understand or validate your realization. There's tremendous freedom in this, but it can also be a bit lonely, because you're no longer seeking belonging in the usual ways, through shared beliefs or shared identities or shared complaints about the world. The belonging you've discovered is more fundamental, a belonging to existence itself, to the totality of what is, to the consciousness that's looking out through all eyes and hearing through all ears and thinking through all minds. This belonging doesn't require agreement or similarity or even liking. It's a recognition of shared being that underlies all the apparent differences of personality and perspective and preference. From this place of fundamental belonging, you can afford to be truly individual, truly unique, truly yourself, because you're no longer afraid of being excluded or rejected or alone. You know that what you most fundamentally are can never be excluded, never be rejected, never be alone, because it's the very ground of all existence, the consciousness within which all experience arises. This is the great paradox. In recognizing that you are everyone and everything, you become free to be this particular someone, this unique expression of the infinite, without apology and without pretense. And so you move through your life, awake and asleep and awake again, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in dreams, sometimes identified with the personal and sometimes resting in the impersonal, sometimes confused about what's happening and sometimes crystal clear. And all of it is okay. All of it is workable. All of it is grist for the mill of awakening. You stop expecting yourself to be in some permanently enlightened state. Stop judging yourself when you get caught in ego patterns. Stop comparing your experience to some ideal of what awakening should look like. You simply meet what's here with as much consciousness as you can muster in this moment. And you trust that this is enough, that this is exactly what's needed, that this is how consciousness wakes up to itself, not all at once in some dramatic transformation, but gradually, unevenly, imperfectly, through these flawed and beautiful human forms. The 5 signs we've explored, the arising of the witness, the shift in relationship to time, the loosening of desire, the weakening of separation, the recognition of existence as play. These are not milestones to be achieved or boxes to be checked off, but dimensions of a single transformation, a turning inside out of consciousness that reveals what was always already true, but had been obscured by identification with the limited self. And this transformation is never complete, never finished, because there's no endpoint to the depth of awakening, no limit to how fully consciousness can know itself, no final resting place where you've arrived and there's nothing more to discover. Every moment is fresh, every moment is new, every moment is an opportunity for deeper recognition, fuller embodiment, clearer expression of what you truly are. And in this ongoing revelation, in this perpetual unfolding of consciousness into greater and greater complexity and simplicity simultaneously, you find not the end of the journey, but the discovery that there never was a journey, that you never left home, that what you were seeking was seeking you, that the one who wants to wake up is already the awakeness itself, temporarily pretending to be asleep so it can experience the joy of waking. So when you notice these signs in yourself, when you feel yourself waking up faster than those around you, perhaps the wisest response is simply to smile at the cosmic joke of it all, at the beautiful absurdity of consciousness playing hide and seek with itself, at the recognition that there's no you waking up faster than them. There's just this eternal awakeness expressing itself in an infinite variety of forms and forgetting itself in an infinite variety of ways. And it's all perfect, all exactly as it should be, all part of the grand dance of existence celebrating its own inexhaustible creativity. And in that smile, in that moment of recognition, something releases, something softens, something opens, and you find yourself back in the simplicity of this moment, this breath, this beating heart, this strange and wonderful fact of being alive, being conscious, being here now, as this, as everything, as nothing, as the eternal presence that has no opposite and no end, appearing as someone reading these words, appearing as the words themselves, appearing as the silence between the words, appearing as the awareness within which all of this arises and passes, the unchanging witness of the endlessly changing play, the still point around which the whole universe revolves, the source and substance of all that is.